Well, thank you, Sebastian. I am Joyce Lee, chair of the AAM Environment Climate Network, and we're so happy you're here today for the Earth Month programming. We would like to invite you to the third in our series, today being the second. April 18th at 12 p.m. Is going to be another program on public community impact and activity, where you can sign up on the AAM's website. Next, please. And next, I would like to share a little bit about our network and our message to you all, and would like to give credit to our past chair, Mark Keene, for putting some of these graphics out. And I'm so proud that our network is being very consistent in living up to the visions and continue to grow and expand. Next, stay on this one. What you're seeing here, some information on climate.gov. As you can see, these charts, they are science-based information that is verified by expert sources, and the aesthetics of the graphics are quite eye-catching. And of course, we do know that there is warming going on. And these are historic data that is relevant to the entire museum field. Therefore, science, art, and history that is so well represented in the field that we are in, climate applies to all of us. And let me reiterate some facts, as this is Earth Month. The planet's average surface temperature has risen more than 1.5 degrees since the late 19th century, and most of the warming occurred in the past 35 years. In addition, the oceans have absorbed much of this increased heat and showing almost 0.4 degrees of Fahrenheit since 1969. And the global sea level has risen about 8 inches in the last century. So I can go on with flood and rainfall and droughts. I guess the key question is, how will your museum and collection thrive in the next 100 years, knowing what we know today? And as many have said, climate is not an added layer, but integral to the museum field. So with that, we have an exciting program coming up, moderated by Sebastián Encina. Thank you very much to you and our speakers. Oh, next, please. And next. I would like to say that we have our goals set up for us: access, thought leadership, global thinking, and advocacy excellence, which you will get plenty of today. Turning over to you, Sebastian.
And thank you so much, Joyce. And welcome to today's presentation to all of you. Thank you so very much for joining us today. My name is Sebastián Encina. I am the former chair of the Collection Stewardship Professional Network of AAM. I'm also an archaeologist, as you can see my pots behind me. I also do run an IDEA committee for collection stewardship. So today's topic is very important in terms of not just environmental justice, but for IDEA issues. A few reminders as we begin. I'm sure by now most of you have done webinars and such, but this is a webinar, not a meeting. As such, you can see the presenters, but the presenters cannot see you. You can hear us, but we also cannot hear you. We do invite people to use the Q&A section to ask questions and also use the chat. We will be monitoring both to look at questions, but try to use the Q&A for those questions. Let's just use the chat to communicate amongst each other. This is being recorded. The recording will be made available at a later date. Unfortunately, we do not have captioning for right now. However, captioning will be added to the recording, which will be available to everybody after today. So the structure of today's presentation, we're doing the introduction, so that's my role here. After me, I'm going to introduce our panelists, our presenters, and we have three of them, and I'll introduce them in a second. They're going to present in order, and then we're going to save the question and answer until the very end. So instead of asking questions after every single presentation, we're going to wait until the end for that. So our program today is Impact. All right, my notes field is jumping all over the place. Apologies for that. So our program today is Impact and Justice, a model for the field and beyond. We will be hearing about a Smithsonian initiative to address local environmental justice or injustice. Today's speakers will present one model for how an institution can begin tackling such an important topic, one that not only addresses environmental concerns, but also touches upon crucial inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility issues. A key takeaway here is how this model came about from three distinct units within the Smithsonian, and how working together will have great results. Those of us who work for larger organizations, such as university where I work, know how difficult it is to overcome the phenomenon of silos. Here we have a successful example of reaching across silos. Today's presenters, in the order in which they will present, are Jennifer Zazo-Brown, Research and Program Specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Katrina Lashley, Program Coordinator at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, and Dr. Alison Cawood, Director of Public Engagement at the Smithsonian Environment Research Center, SERC. At the end, we will share their emails with you. So if you have any particular questions for any of the presenters, you'll be able to contact them yourself. With that, I'm going to turn the microphone and screen over to Jennifer Zazo-Brown. Jennifer, all yours.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'd like to thank AAM's Environment and Climate Network for the invitation to share more about our new urban environmentalism training today. And if you can click to the next slide, please. I'd like to start off my presentation here with these three framing questions for today's discussion. In our initial conversations at the start of this collaboration between our units, some of the things that we discussed and questions that we teased out centered around the specific role of museums and the obligations we have to the communities we serve. Specifically, how can museums and cultural institutions serve as civic spaces to engage our constituents in critical conversations? What does that look like in practice? What kinds of opportunities can we create for community members to become more involved in addressing environmental concerns? How do we work with partners and community activists to effectively do that? And what role do cultural organizations like the Smithsonian play in training the next generation of museum professionals and scientists alike? How can we leverage the resources of the Smithsonian to create a pipeline for new talent? Next slide, please. As a hub for research and education, the Smithsonian Institution's purpose has always been to increase and diffuse knowledge. Now in the final year of SI's current 5-year strategic plan, the Smithsonian has vowed to build on its unique strengths to engage and inspire more people where they are with greater impact, while catalyzing critical conversations on issues affecting our nation and our world. Our interdisciplinary approach to professional development in this model is built on this idea of a one Smithsonian, creating a template for ways in which participating institutions can address complicated issues and global problems, such as environmental and food injustice, climate change, and the rapid loss of natural resources resulting from human activities and population pressures. That requires work that spans the disciplines and organizational boundaries of our individual units. So breaking down the silos, like Sebastian mentioned. For the purposes of today's talk, my colleagues and I have approached this project in 3 parts. I'm going to share more about where we started and what inspired this collaboration in the first place. Katrina is going to address where we are now with the urban environmental training and what that looks like as a hybrid course. And Alison will share a bit more about where we are going with this workshop and its application beyond its original intent. Next slide, please. So a little background about us. The Office of Strategic Partnerships at the National Museum of African American History and Culture was created in direct response to the enacting legislation that brought the museum into existence. The vision for NAMAC is that it would stand as a welcoming place that celebrated the remarkable stories of African Americans through its presence on the National Mall, as well as through programs that would enhance equity, social justice, and recognition of the essential role of African American life in the national story. Founding Director Lonnie Bunch, now Secretary of the Smithsonian, created the Office of Strategic Partnerships as a formal redress to the systemic underinvestment in African American museums, documented in over 50 years of public and professional demands for professional equity and inclusion by African American museum professional leadership around the country. You can see this reflected in the language here in the legislation that specifically calls for collaboration between the museum and other museums, historically Black colleges and universities, historical societies, and educational institutions. It also specifically includes the word collaboration, something that you're going to hear me talk about a lot in my presentation today. As it pertains, and collaboration as it pertains to the development of cooperative programs and exhibitions, the care of collections, and explicitly the training of museum professionals. Next slide, please. So how do we serve? Through its partnerships, OSP supports professional development, capacity building, and sustainability in organizations that address the history, art, and culture of African Americans and the African diaspora. OSP's professional programs, developed in collaboration with trusted partners who provide subject matter expertise, pursue both institutional and professional development equity and social justice goals. These programs fill documented gaps in knowledge, access, and opportunity within the museum field, particularly for historically under-resourced organizations. OSP programs foster more equitable participation and access to resources, best practices, training, and career advancing opportunities to better tell the full story of African Americans and diasporic African cultures. Through OSP's placement within a Smithsonian museum, it is able to leverage high visibility with a range of institutional partners, stakeholder organizations, and individual professionals across the museum field. We used to say that OSP is a startup within a startup because we are the only office of its kind that exists within the Smithsonian structure. Originally founded in 2012 to help lead up the museum's founding initiatives prior to the physical opening of our museum building, OSP is now entering its tween years and has built a repertoire of programs and initiatives that have deepened their roots and started to sprout new ideas and spin-offs of their own. Some of these programs include and initiatives include our OSP's HBCU History and Culture Access Consortium, a multi-year initiative collaborating with museums and archive directors of historically Black colleges and universities, our board building and preservation leadership training with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Robert F. Smith Internships and Fellowship Program, and NAMAC's Ethical Interpretation Workshop. Next slide, please. The urban environmentalism training that we're talking about today is directly modeled after OSP's Ethical Interpretation Workshop, one of the longest running programs in our office. This training launched as an early initiative at OSP in early 2016, prior to the museum's opening. The workshop provides technical training for museum professionals on interpretive theory and ethical practice. Appropriate use of language and cultural frameworks are some of the best practices covered in the course, along with applicable tools participants can use to better engage visitors in discussing difficult topics and contested narratives at their home institutions. Listed here are also some of the core tenets of the workshop, as well as key strategies used by workshop facilitators, including using immersive and experiential activities like conducting site visits to important and significant sites to help frame what cohort members are learning in the training. In some years, this also included opportunities for participants to meet and engage with members of descendant communities. Cohort members also, one of the other things that we focus on, the last component here, is helping to build a community of practice. This kind of happened organically in the beginning, though we are much more intentional about it now. But the training fosters a space where cohort members can engage with one another to effectively build a community of practice and support among peers and colleagues in the field. Next slide, please. As we approached the 5th year of the Ethical Interpretation Workshop, program staff embarked on an evaluation of the workshop curriculum as a whole to identify areas for potential growth and ensure this training remains relevant to the needs of museum and cultural heritage professionals. As we first developed a SurveyMonkey questionnaire that was sent out to all workshop graduates, approximately 50 participants at the time, and also held a stakeholder convening in November of 2019 in Charleston, South Carolina, to think strategically about the way forward beyond year 5. Following that gathering, workshop staff implemented some of the immediate changes to the structure and curriculum during the January 2020 workshop that immediately followed. However, the project team was still working through the implementation of larger programmatic changes when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. OSP decided to cancel the 2021 Ethical Interpretation Workshop altogether and instead use the time to pause and reflect. We decided to build upon the evaluation that we started in 2019 and reached out to our colleagues at SOAR to conduct a year-long evaluation of the program. Just to note here that SOAR stands for the Smithsonian Organization and Audience Research. It is the Central Planning, Research, and Evaluation Office of the Smithsonian Institution. Just yet another collaboration to show sort of the way that we're working across our boundaries to break down silos within the institution. With this in-depth evaluation, OSP was specifically looking for a better understanding of the impact that the workshop has had, not only on its cohort members, but also on participating organizations, their visitors, and the field at large. You can see sort of some of the methodology that was used here by our SOAR colleagues, conducting in-depth qualitative interviews with participants, some of our facilitators, program founders, et cetera. And there's going to be a report that will be published and released later this year of the findings. Next slide, please. So just a few snapshots here of some of the statistical data that came out of this larger evaluation. With the exception of 2021, the workshop has been offered annually since 2016 and has served 65 institutions to date. While most graduates of the program worked at institutions located in the American South, participants were from all regions of the country. In the 5 years of the program, there have been cohort members from 27 US states, as well as one international participant from Barbados. And now that we have a format for the workshop that's moved to a hybrid model, OSP is hoping to increase its reach and participation from international. Next slide, please. The workshop has now graduated over 60 participants of the program. Most cohort members in the program have been early or mid-career professionals. It's between 4 and 18 years of experience, as you can see demonstrated here on the chart. There's also been a few emerging professionals in the first few years of their career, as well as one veteran with over 19 years in the fields. Again, this workshop serves as a model for the development of the urban environmentalism training. So in thinking about our starting point, who our intended audience is, the information concerning participant experience, individual training needs, and the position in the field were all useful pieces of data that were analyzed to help build the profile of the intended audience for urban environmentalism. Next slide, please. Here we have a quick visual of the instructional design process, and I'm not going to get too heavy into the details of the actual program because my colleague is going to detail that for you in the next presentation. But as I'd mentioned before, the complete redesign of the curriculum for the Ethical Interpretation Workshop was effectively transitioned from a place-based training into a hybrid model that can now be offered partially remote or 100% virtual as needed. The pivot to virtual facilitation from a group learning environment was really not a simple one, and it did require some efficient time, and resources to properly prepare. So once again, in the spirit of collaboration, OSP reached out to SI colleagues for assistance in this process. This time it was Smithsonian Enterprises to help secure help with instructional design process and building of an online educational course that will be facilitated through Smithsonian's edX platform. Our colleague and lead instructional designer on the project walked us through each stage of the design process using the new hybrid program template we created as a guide. Our initial conversations started off as brainstorming sessions where Katrina and I shared some of our key elements of the work that we do that ultimately helped to inform the content and design of the urban environmentalism program. One of the foundational elements of the workshop was identifying the daily focus of each day. These big ideas were directly linked to the SurveyMonkey questionnaire we queried ethical interpretation cohort members about in 2019. The main topics that emerged as the focus for additional trainings and the catalyst for the collaboration between the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Anacostia Community Museum were environmental justice, working with youth, building strategic partnerships, and conducting oral histories. We then, once we started to get the focus down, we then invited approximately about a dozen professionals from community museums or cultural organizations committed to developing programming around engaging communities with the environment and asked them to serve as beta testers for a one-day convening to test some of our early content. This led to yet another partnership with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center that you'll learn more about from Dr. Cawood in just a bit. Next slide, please. Our program is scheduled to launch in just a few short weeks. Here is a very high-level outline of what the hybrid training model looks like in terms of urban environmentalism. We will have first 3 days of virtual sessions. Again, those will be delivered through the Smithsonian edX platform and Zoom platforms. During this time, participants will have an opportunity to start to work on their individual action plans, which I think Katrina will be detailing and talking a little bit more about in just a bit. After that, following the virtual sessions in the following week is when we head into in-person sessions, and that is slated for May 15th through the 17th. These are site-specific experiences in Washington, D.C., including a boat trip down the Anacostia River and museum visits to the Anacostia Community Museum, as well as a mock. And then finally, cohort presentations will close out the workshop on the final day. I will not miss the opportunity, before turning things over to Katrina, I will not miss the opportunity to share that the application process is still open for a few more hours. So if you'd like to submit a packet to be considered for the 2022 cohort, please click the link in the chat and you will be directed to OSP's website where you can find the information you need to apply for this year's cohort. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share today, and I'm going to turn things over to Katrina.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so once again, very excited to be with you today. I want to provide an overview of the Urban Waterways Project and provide more details about our urban environmental training that's starting later next month. So the Anacostia Community Museum was founded in 1967 as the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum. And it was very clear from the very beginning in terms of John Kennard, who was the founding director, his staff, and the community leaders who helped to develop the museum, that this museum needed to be more than just an outpost of the Smithsonian to encourage people to come down to the mall. They really wanted it to be an extension of the community, a civic space where when community members walked in, they encountered themselves, their histories and their realities. So it would be a place of a moment of celebration, but also a museum that recognized the challenges that existed in the present, and they would join with community partners to have discussions standing in the present to understand how they came to be. So looking to the past to understand the present and to make plans to envision possible futures. And so really seeing the museum and its community residents really as partners in every sense of the term. I really want to kind of basically place ourselves physically, but also would say psychologically and possibly emotionally on the map. So the Anacostia River is the eastern branch of the Potomac River. I refer to it as DC's second river. It flows down from Maryland into DC, and it cuts the city of Washington, DC between west and east. And so if you follow my little white arrow here, this is the National Mall, where not all but most of the Smithsonian units are located. And the Anacostia Community Museum is located in the historic community of Anacostia. And so you'll see that the Anacostia River really for centuries really has been a dividing line in the city in multiple ways. As you can see, there are multiple communities east of the Anacostia River. However, there's a practice to refer to everything east of the river as Anacostia. The river has been dividing line in terms of access to resources, access to power, dividing line in terms of class, resources, justice in many ways. And so in 2010, senior historian Gail Lowe, in the context of ongoing conversation and excitement in terms of the redevelopment of the Anacostia River, especially looking at the west of the river, that the river and its green spaces would become a new kind of civic meeting place for both sides of the city. Dr. Lowe really wanted to explore this, how did the river come to that exact moment in time? What was the ongoing relationship between the Anacostia and its communities? And if we're thinking about this as a relationship, how do we explore this ongoing relationship, this environmental history through multiple angles? And so the project really kind of operates from the notion that communities and their waterways share not only a physical space, but ongoing history recognized or not, that communities are made up of green, blue, and gray spaces, and that the impacts of waterways extend far beyond their banks. And so one of the first really important main goals for the project has been this breakdown, this idea of silos, of this really kind of these borders between various disciplines, with the understanding that everything intersects and meets at these waterways. And so if you are studying the water quality of the Anacostia River, if studying the health of the fish, you should be in conversation with historians who've been documenting the river over decades. You should be in conversation with a local resident whose father learned to swim in the tributary of the Anacostia, or a leader of a faith congregation who helps to lead cleanups on weekends along the Anacostia River. It's really this idea of bringing all interested parties into conversation with each other to share their experiences, but also share their expertise and their best practices. And so the project really was conceived with the Anacostia and the city of DC, particularly east of the river, Anacostia, in conversation with other communities nationally and internationally with similar histories, who are also having these conversations, possibly these arguments, making plans for the next step or the restoration recovery of their waterways. So how is DC and the Anacostia River similar to or different to, for example, communities in LA, communities on the island of Oahu, communities in Gulfport, Biloxi, London, Pittsburgh, and Louisville. And so our first goal really is, how do we bring all possible participants into the conversation with each other, both physically and virtually? So this image here, you see from our 2015 National Symposium, or Urban Waterways Symposium, our 3 of our project collaborators are meeting for the first time. And then we have Dr. Gail Lowe in conversation with Irma Munoz in Los Angeles. Irma is a long-standing supporter of the project, and she's the head and leader of Mujeres de la Tierra, working with communities living along the Anacostia, along the LA River. Our second main goal of this project has been this idea of documentation. So what are different ways that we can document firsthand the experiences of the various stakeholders living along these waterways, engaged in these waterways, and advocating for these waterways and their communities? So oral histories have been really, really key in terms of us gathering this firsthand information. We believe that our partners can speak for themselves. We are simply a platform to amplify their voice if they choose to join us as part of the project. And so oral histories have taken place in the museum's library. You see Dr. Gail Lowe in conversation with former Mayor Anthony Williams, and some images of my research trip to Gulfport and conversation with key members there. And so once again, how do we capture firsthand experiences of life along these waterways? And how do we make sure that we broaden the historical record, especially in cities that are facing rapid change, neighborhood change, gentrification, how to make sure that these histories, these experiences are captured. Another major goal has been photographic documentation. So what do these waterways look like? What are the environments? What do people experience as they move through the physical spaces of their communities? So here's a shot of the Anacostia River with RFK Stadium rising in the background. How are community members already using these blue and green spaces as civic spaces, as meeting places, as places of community of connection? So there's a picnic taking place in Anacostia Park. Behind you see the Anacostia River. And then how are different ways that community members are engaging other audiences, other residents in connecting to the resources along the river. So we have Falcon and Rodney Stott's this image introducing Mr. Hoots to a festival goer. And then we have DC Dragons on the Anacostia River in the practice section with traffic kind of moving by on the bridge. Another major part of this project really has been engagement. So anyone who's interested in exploring these conversations and taking part in this work or sharing their work and best practices, how do we engage them? So the first major presentation to our community partners was Reclaiming the Edge, Urban Waterways and Civic Engagement in 2012. So introducing the Anacostia story, the Anacostia watershed, the flora, the fauna, but also the people's experiences along the waterway over the centuries. What have we taken from the river, both tangible and intangible, over time? And so as community members enter the gallery space, they literally encounter themselves. They encounter familiar blue spaces, green spaces, and they encounter their histories. And so you see members of the Seafarers Yacht Club who have been active along the Anacostia River since 1945, who've been instrumental in creating access to the river and its environs, and who in 1985 started the annual Anacostia cleanup, meeting themselves, literally seeing their history presented in the gallery space. And also the inclusion of community voice has been an ongoing priority. And so as you walk through the gallery space, you encounter, for example, various audio clips or video clips. This one is taken from River of Memories, people talking about their experiences growing up on the Anacostia. And then a poem that I've pulled out, written by L.J. Johnson about 22 years ago, thinking about the Anacostia River, its present experience, but also what he envisions and hopes for the river's future. And youth programming is another really important part of our engagement over time. Our youth stem from elementary through high school. So having them use the exhibition as a kind of springboard into the larger spaces of their community, out on the waterways, taking place in activities in classrooms, living classrooms, floating classrooms, Susquehanna, but also our teen programs where they actually explore the Anacostia watershed from the very source down through Maryland and DC, the green spaces, blue spaces, working with our partners, CERC, and you'll meet one of our collaborators, Dr. Alison Cawood, later on. And also for every year that they're in the program, doing a research project on an issue pertaining to the Anacostia River, and then presenting to at least 3 community organizations. So this idea of environmentalism as a form of civic engagement, they have the right to be informed, to know and to question, and to be in conversation with other community members in terms of issues connected to the Anacostia River and the health of their communities. Ongoing conversations, national symposium, so 2015 Urban Waterway Symposium, 2018, a Women's Environmental Leadership, our initiative launched with the very first summit. So how do we bring together practicing women environmental leaders in conversation with the next generation on issues of mentorship, training, and then leadership? How do we build capacity for the future? And then very locally, prior to the pandemic, our community forums, very local in scope, 3 or 4 different speakers from moderator talking about their experiences on this particular issue, then open up to Q&A and conversation. With the pandemic, we shifted to a virtual platform and we were able to expand this nationally and internationally. And then various publications. And so our publications range from reports from our various summits, but also, for example, you see here, Women, Environmentalism and Justice, which is aimed at middle schoolers. So introducing middle school students to some of the women that we've documented as part of our project, women who are environmental leaders, who think about environment in different ways, who are engaging environment in different ways, looking at their personal journeys, but also professional journeys. And finally, we have our virtual engagement with our project website. And so sharing some of our images or history clips, but also sharing the project newsletter. We have about 10 issues and we're launching next year as a larger reach in terms of how do we continue this ongoing conversation. And once again, not speaking for our partners, but serving as a platform for our partners. And so we understand, we recognize that the Anacostia River and urban waterways is only a model, okay? So participants in our workshops, we understand that communities differ, organizations differ, environmental issues will differ. Some are experiencing an urban experience, others are rural, or some a combination of both. So we asked our workshop participants, how would you apply this model to your own organizations and to your communities? And once we ask you the question, the goal of the workshop is to work through with participants and have them build toward this engagement with their community partners around an environmental issue of their choosing. And so from the very start, they're working through developing the action plan. And so this action plan features in every single day, every single step in terms of the 5 days of the workshop. And so the workshops are divided into 3 different sections. First, we have the case study where they meet the partners, community partners. They hear from them, they're in conversation with them. Then there is the case study debrief where we ask them to think about what they just heard. How does it apply to them and their communities? What seems familiar? What do they think will work in terms of engaging the different their stakeholders? What will not work, or what will work with a simple kind of tweaking or just kind of reformatting? And this debrief takes place in the form of guided conversations, but also in activities that are framed through the lenses of facilitation tools that we're using liberating concepts in Project Zero. And then the final part of the day is making connections, where they're actually building on planning out their action plans. And so over the course of the next couple slides, I want to kind of break down the 5 days in terms of the focus, in this case, defining environmental history, the capstone objective or the action plan objective, in this case, identifying community concern, and then the case study and some of the questions that are explored. So the first day after defining the notion of environmental history, we find out a bit more about the Anacostia Urban Waterways Project. We also have them kind of building or mapping their communities. And so we ask them to map their communities, really is a visual brainstorming. Is a representational map of what are the civic buildings, the cultural institutions, the public lands, the waterways, the sites that need to be protected and preserved, sites that have been lost. And also in terms of mapping places, we also ask them to map people. Who are the elders in your community that are really important to having these conversations? Who are the emerging youth leaders? And that's the first part of the mapping section. The second layer of the map will be, okay, this is what this is your community, this is what you've mapped. Now, what are some environmental issues, possible environmental issues of concern? Who are possible partners? And what are spaces that can be used as a form of civic engagement? So at the end of the first day, you have the very first step in terms of the action plan, community concern, and have a community map that will be referred to again and again. Second day, we're looking at partner organizations. And after meeting our case study, meeting our community partners, they go back and they refine their community maps again. Who are specific community partners that you know in your own communities that will be great to partner with? And then they add that to their action plan. The third day, we focus on audiences through a youth engagement lens for this day. So who are the audiences that you engage currently? Who are the audiences that you can engage? Realizing that we can't engage everyone. And how do we think about programming and how are logic models tools for developing programming over time? And so at the end of the third day, as part of the Making Connections, they've added that step to their action plan. And that ends the virtual component piece. And then they join us in person or on site in DC for the last 2 days of the workshop. The fourth day is looking at the notion of documentation and then what are possible results of the engagement. They visit the Anacostia Community Museum. They have a conversation with Rachel Seidman, who's currently developing our next exhibition looking at environmental issues. To live without harm, women of color, and the development of environmental justice in the greater Washington area. So talking to Rachel about how does she go about building this project, building this exhibition, what forms of documentation she's been using, and how does the museum or can a museum serve as a convener of multiple voices, stakeholders through this upcoming exhibition. They then move to an exploration of the Anacostia River itself. So they've heard about the river, they've heard about the project, they've met our various partners, the various stakeholders who have been advocating on the waterway over the course of 10, 15, 20 years. And so now with the Anacostia Watershed Community, who is an ongoing partner in this work, whose work we've documented over the course of 12 years, they will guide us on a 2-hour tour down the Anacostia River. So moving through both the blue and green spaces, pointing out the sites of interest. We'll be joined in this tour down the river with prior guest speakers who have worked along the river, who've advocated the river over the course of time. And so our workshop participants, they've heard about the Anacostia River, and then they move through this space. And we asked them, the Anacostia River really is our hook, is our connection to place in DC for the Anacostia River. What would be the space in your communities that would be representing connection to place? What would be the hook that could gather various stakeholders together to address an environmental issue? At the end of the day, they work on the last 2 parts of their action plan, documentation, and just the results of the engagement activities. And the final day of the workshop is time for presentations. And so for presentations, we ask them 2 things. Please present your communities based on the maps you created on day 1, and then guide us through your action plan. When you leave DC, what will be the next steps in terms of you working with community partners, stakeholders in addressing, exploring, documenting environmental issue of major concern for both your organization and your community partners. And then they're in conversation with a curator at the NAMOC, looking at NAMOC's community curation program, and then they could tour Power Place, thinking about the communities that are featured and their connections to blue and green spaces. And so we started the development of this workshop last March, and a really important part of this development of this workshop was beta testing. And so beta testing really involved both internal and external Smithsonian partners. And a couple months after our beta testing, one of our colleagues at CERC, Dr. Alison Cawood, reached out to us. She was also in the process of developing a training program, and she really wanted to talk to us about, say, how could this workshop be a tool to engage the participants as they go about their work. So Alison, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katrina. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm a little the odd person out, right? I am not a museum specialist. I don't work in a museum. We are part of the Smithsonian, but we are at the Environmental Research Center. So I often describe it as like a university environmental science department, but without students for the most part. So we have a bunch of scientists doing all kinds of environmental science. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do, and then how this and what I do, I'm a marine ecologist by training. So how this all ties into the work that Jennifer and Katrina have been describing, and where I fit into this. So I am at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. It is on the shores of Chesapeake Bay. We have a pretty big campus. It's about 3,000 acres. A lot of that's on the water. Most of that is undeveloped. We have kind of a core campus and an education campus, but most of that is undeveloped. And we do a lot of work that looks at kind of this land-sea interface and where people and the water interact. So we do work that focuses on things like climate change and sea level rise. We have one of the longest running climate change experiments in the world is on our campus. We do a lot of work looking at the health and the diversity of forests and understanding forest restoration and how we can do that more effectively and the roles that forests are playing in ecosystems and in conserving ecosystems. We do a lot of work related to invasive species, some related to invasive plants, but a lot related to invasive species in coastal habitats. So where boats are moving things around and what that does to these coastal systems. We look a lot at species interactions. So how do things like climate change and human impacts change the way that species act with each other, and what does that look like? The photograph here is one of our technicians is shucking this oyster and looking at oyster disease. So oyster disease, there's a couple of diseases that are really problematic in Chesapeake Bay and seem to have lots of ties to climate change and those dynamics. And we get to do a little bit of, that's a lot of doom and gloom kinds of work. We do get to do a little bit of positive work, and we think about restoring native species and how can you do that effectively, and what does that mean, and what are you restoring to? So that's kind of CERC as a whole. I said I was a marine ecologist by training, but what I do here at CERC is I run the public engagement programs. So those are the programs that we have for people who don't work here, essentially, right? So this is volunteers, this is students and teachers and community members who are part of these, who we run programs for. And one of the big pieces that I run is for our interns and fellows. So we have a pretty big internship program. It's primarily undergraduates, but we do have some high school students and some recent grads or some master's students who will join us at some, at different points. We run about 40 interns a year. Will be part of our program. Most of that is on site, although not as much for the past couple of years, but currently most of that is on site. They're all paid. They're all placed in a lab and have a research mentor. And then they all have like a series of professional development activities that they do outside of that. So we talk about careers in STEM, we talk about science communication, and those kinds of things. And they're all required to do final presentations as part of their internships. So in running this program, I spend a lot of time thinking about the way that I was trained as a scientist and chose not to stay in a research path, but what I was trained and what I was taught and how that does or doesn't help me in the things that I do now, where I'm working on more of a public facing side of things. And also what we do, what we can and should be doing for students. How are we training scientists to be better and better address some of the big challenges that, like Joyce brought up at the very beginning, that we are facing globally. And Jennifer and Katrina have both talked some about silos, and not only within kind of the Smithsonian community and things are there silos, but I'm sure you are all like really aware of like these disciplinary silos and even kind of silos of place. So in science, historically, you've wanted to go away from all the people. That's where you do the science, right? The people mess things up for whatever system you want to study. The people are the problem in that. And that's problematic in a lot of ways, because then it's really hard to solve the problems that people are dealing with. And so in the past, 15 or so years, there's been a lot more effort within scientific communities to kind of push for better understanding of community needs, better incorporation of community voice and perspectives into the work that they do. And this has been something that colleagues who do things like public health and things have long been aware of. But those of us who do things that were a little more out there, a little more in that, like, okay, you're going to go far away from the people to do your work, were, it's still a relatively new concept, but it's getting there. So I wanted to use an example. I have a colleague who is a heliophysicist at NASA. And so she studies solar flares and the dynamics of the sun, which is not something you inherently think about people being connected to, about communities being connected to. One of the things that she looks at, though, is auroras. And so like the aurora borealis, and she started a project where people were submitting photographs to her. The project is called Aurorasaurus, and people submit photographs of these aurora. And she ran it that way for, I don't know, several years. And as she started doing that and started really thinking about it, she started to really get into ideas about understanding who was impacted by her work and who should be and who the stakeholders really are. And recognizing, this was mostly an excuse to throw a pretty picture in, but recognizing that a lot of the places where people were seeing these aurora, a lot of the communities that were like looking at some of these things were indigenous communities in some of the Arctic regions of North America. And so she has really started to try to incorporate that into the work that she does. And she's a heliophysicist. She doesn't have a background in community research. She doesn't have a background in any of those things, but she's really been trying to incorporate that into the work that she does and to engage those communities and to understand the importance of the aurora in those communities and understand what kinds of questions people have and how she can better connect those pieces. So this is kind of the space that I live in all the time. And things that I think about a lot. And so when Jennifer and Katrina were doing the beta test and they invited me to be part of that, it was, it kind of stuck in my head. And then there was a call from the National Science Foundation for this program that's called RAMP. It's Research and Mentoring for Post-Baccalaureates in Biological Sciences. And so I worked with some colleagues and put together a proposal that would work on this comparative ecosystem research. So again, like really kind of technical STEM things, but it has this heavy training component, and that's really where I fit in. And so I reached out to Katrina and Jennifer and to talk to them about what it might look like, because I had been in there in the beta test for their course and heard some of the things they wanted to talk about. And this seemed like this really amazing opportunity to write in this training, to have these early career researchers think about their science, because we're working with these are just graduated, but people who want careers in research, and to get them to think about who is impacted by the questions that they ask, why they ask the questions that they're asking, who's served by the work that they do, who's served by the work that they do, who the stakeholders are, and all of those kinds of things, which is exactly what the urban environmentalism course is really thinking about. Wasn't designed to do that through a STEM lens or through an early career kind of training lens, but I think it could be really easily adapted. And so in talking to Katrina and Jennifer, we talked about how the urban environmentalism course could be a way to introduce these trainees to looking at their work through a community lens, to just getting them to start thinking about who is impacted by their work and why that matters. And it really wouldn't require a lot of adaptation. So something we're really excited about. And that is all that I have. And so I'm gonna turn it back over to Sebastian. Thank you all for having me.
So thank you so very much, Alison, Katrina, and Jennifer. I want to have this slide up just to get people thinking about, this is a motto. How can this be applied to your own communities, in your own organizations, in your own situations? With a few minutes left, we have a couple of questions that came in. One of them comes from Bridget Miller, and I'm going to tweak the question a little bit, but the question is, as a new museum, how do you go about building trust with the community in order to implement community-based projects like urban waterways. But I don't think that's just a new museum question. And I think that's something that all of us, I think, I don't know if I want to say struggle with, but that's a question that we want to work with communities, but trust doesn't just happen. So Katrina and Alison and Jennifer, any of you want to answer that? Like, how do you get the community to trust us? Alison, you mentioned the Aurorasaurus, which is a great name, the Aurorasaurus project, working with the indigenous, and there's reason for mistrust there from some indigenous communities with museums. How do you build that trust?
So I'll start. I think in terms of urban waterways and stepping into the project, I think we're very fortunate, at least I was very fortunate to be able to step into an organization that at that point, 45 years in, had established a sense of trust and connection to the various communities I had served. So the first wave of ACM staff, John Kernards or Dr. Hutchinson, they were embedded members of the community, right? And so they were different organizations, different community leaders were familiar with the work of the Anacostia Community Museum, but also I think just the way in terms of the practice that has been established over time. And so it has never been, in terms of the way ACM approaches work, it's not Smithsonian coming down from the mountaintop to engage the community. It's simply we are a Smithsonian Community Museum. We're interested in doing this work. This is our project. We've heard about your work. We would love to hear more. Are you interested in being in equal partnership with us? And so for us, it is truly an act of shared authority, but also it's simply this idea of just building relationships through conversation. It can be the first simple meeting. Hello, my name is, I'm reaching out from ACM, and you have that one meeting. That's it, just to meet your work, where you're from. And then you build continued opportunities for engagement, for conversations, for collaboration in various events taking place at the museum. And it's sitting and having these conversations, people get a chance to know who you are as a person, who you are as a professional. If you've been embedded in the community for a while, other people will vouch for you. But if you're new to the work, I think you simply have to take a stock of the community. Okay, so who are the various community stakeholders at play? But also understand that leadership comes in multiple forms. And so who I would say, I don't like the word gatekeeper, that's a kind of negative connotation. Who are the elders who have been always present in this community, in these various spaces? How do I connect to them? How do I introduce myself and my organization? And understand it will take more than one, simply a phone call or a handshake. It's again and again, how do I make myself present in these community spaces, events? And once these community leaders see you, recognize you, and then they can vouch for you, then you get an introduction to their larger networks. But really it's the building reputation of being willing to share authority, but in having these conversations of working in partnership with community audiences, but really it's built over time and over practice, and being allowed to be led by community partners and being led and trusting in their expertise, that they understand their community's past, present, community history, and they have very much of value to add to the conversation as you both kind of work together to kind of explore and kind of tease out, in our case, these community histories, and then what does that engagement look like? What can it look like moving forward together as equal partners? Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. And I don't know if Jennifer or Alison want to add a little something there as well. If not, we can.
Yeah, I can add a little bit, mostly just that, from where I come in on the science side, this is not something that has historically been taught. And that's why I think that these kinds of things are really exciting, and the opportunity to work with people who do museum studies, who come at this from more of a social and a cultural lens is really important. That's also why I'm really excited about starting it with early career folks. So they're learning to do this in a better way instead of unlearning to do it in the wrong way, which is more what I think in kind of natural science research has been happening. So I think it goes back to kind of that partnerships and that working with other people who understand how to do this work better than you do. Maybe that there are people out there who have been doing this work for decades. So it's just connecting with those folks.
Thank you. And I think both of you, all three of you, are saying things that are so strong here. Alison and Jennifer touched upon it earlier. We can't be all experts in everything, and it helps to collaborate with other people. and bring in their expertise. And I appreciate what you said, Katrina, about the museum as a platform. We want to listen to people. We want to, like you said, gatekeeper is kind of a wrong term for that, but we want to give them that platform, be that community anchor that we can be for them. So it's all really amazing things. Another question that came in, kind of a long one, so bear with me. Will the ethical interpretation workshop virtual sessions on edX be made available to any participant on edX, or is it limited to only the successful applicants for this year's cohort? If not available to anyone who is interested in attending on edX, will it be made available as an open enrollment course in the near future? Sounds like a great course and should be made available to any museum professional who is interested in continuing professional development. So that's the question.
Yeah, I will jump in on that one. It's a great question. So thank you for that. We up at this point have just sort of completed our edX course, and it is a course for enrolled applicants because the sessions are going to be taught live. So we're not yet at the point where we do have an open enrollment course that can be self-guided. But one of the big challenges and successes of this past year is that we were working on creating a new workbook that would accompany the ethical interpretation workshop that is just getting ready to go to print now. And so a lot of like the next phase or the next progression in these online courses is thinking about greater access to them. So while we don't have those available as an open enrollment course this year, there probably will be some opportunities in the near future to have some access to that information, both for ethical interpretation and hopefully for urban environmentalism as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we have about a minute left. And I do work at a university, and I think teaching students how to present is something that's really important. How do we get the information, out of journals, out of those silos, and getting them out? And as you can see, I'm an archaeologist with all my pots behind me, and I think about that collaboration. So I'm kind of curious, final thoughts on how can we expand this? How can we bring collections people? We have education. How do we bring more exhibitions people, departments, and so on into all these collaborations? Because this is some wonderful work. So any thoughts from our panelists on more collaboration?
I think in the few minutes that we have left, one of my thoughts about how do we bring collections and how do we bring exhibitions into them. I think that trying to find greater ways to actually share the resources of our individual institutions. So having a greater understanding of what exists in collections, what exists in archives. I think that's a great challenge to collaboration, is just simply not knowing what's available and ways in which we can collaborate. So I would just encourage us all on the line to think about ways that we can cross over boundaries and break down silos to communicate what our expertise is, what our collections are, what our resources are, and just be more open and willing to share those with other colleagues in the field in order to continue this practice of collaboration.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer. And with that, we are at time. This is such amazing information. Thank you to Jennifer, Katrina, and Alison for the wonderful presentation. On the screen right now are their emails. They are brave enough to put their emails out there, so go ahead and contact them if you have any further questions. As Joyce mentioned at the beginning, this is the second in a series of ECN webinars, so please check the calendar. There'll be some more coming up in celebration of Earth Day, Earth Month, I should say. This is being recorded, so we will share this when everything is all processed and everything. On that note, I want to thank all our participants, to Jennifer, Katrina, Alison, but also to Kate, who's running things behind the scenes, and Joyce for putting all this together. And thanks to all the attendees today. This couldn't happen without you. Such important work, and we're all working together to make this happen. So thank you all so very, very much, and have a great day, everybody.